The morning smelled like rain and old wood and something I couldn't name. I sat behind my bench at 7:45 with a coffee that had already gone cold. Outside the window, the October sky was the color of ash. And there was one file sitting on top of my stack that made me set that coffee down. My name is Judge Earl Whitfield. I've sat in this chair for 31 years. I've seen thousands of faces walk through that door, scared ones, angry ones, exhausted ones, broken ones, and sometimes all four at once. Most days I can feel the shape of a case before the first word is spoken, but every once in a while something comes in that breaks a part of you open that you didn't know was still capable of breaking. If you've ever been the person who showed up even when it cost you everything just to get there, I need you to stay with me right now. Because what happened in my courtroom that Tuesday morning is something I have never stopped carrying. My courtroom is on the 3rd floor of a county building that went up in 1962. The walls are beige. They used to be white. The fluorescent lights overhead hum, not loudly, just constantly, all day, every day. On a quiet morning, that hum is the only sound in the whole room. There are 6 rows of wooden benches behind the bar, and most days only a handful of people fill them. The wood is old and dark, worn smooth from decades of people sitting and waiting and hoping. That Tuesday was the last week of October. Rain had been coming and going since Sunday. The trees outside had dropped most of their leaves by then. Everything looked stripped and gray and tired. I remember thinking it felt like the world was holding its breath before something came. I had a feeling about that particular morning before I had even opened the first file. The file in front of me had a total charge of $714. I want you to hear that number for what it really is. For some people, that number is a car payment. For others, it's everything left in the account after the rent clears. For someone already stretched too thin, that number doesn't just represent a fine. It represents something tipping all the way over. I've been in this room long enough to know the difference between a fine and a punishment, and this one had crossed over. The violations on paper were 3: an expired registration, 18 months overdue, a broken taillight noted at the time of the stop, and a failure to appear at the original hearing date, which is what pushed the total past $600. The system doesn't ask why you missed that date. It doesn't wait to find out what was happening in your life. It simply adds the number and moves to the next file. The bailiff had already come in and set up his station by 7:50. My clerk had arranged the files neatly on my desk. The courtroom smelled like cleaning solution and old paper. A few people had started filtering in from the public entrance, and I could hear their footsteps on the floor below. I've always felt this part of the morning most sharply, the quiet before the work begins, the moment when the weight of what is about to happen is still just potential and everything still feels possible. I looked at the name on the file. I looked at the date of birth. She was 63 years old. I set the file back down slowly. I picked up my cold coffee and took a sip I didn't need. Something in me had already started waiting for what was about to come through that door. She came in at exactly 9:04 in the morning. I know the precise time because I was watching the clock when the door opened. The bailiff called her name. She didn't look up when he said it. She just walked forward with her eyes low, like someone trying very hard not to take up too much space in the room. She was a small woman. Not short exactly, but compact, like someone who had spent a long time learning to fold herself down. She was wearing a black dress, a funeral dress, clean and pressed, but the hem at the bottom was damp, wet from the puddles outside. She hadn't noticed or hadn't thought it mattered enough to fix before walking through the door. Her hair was silver and pulled back tight, but several pieces had come loose around her ears and she hadn't fixed them. Her shoes were flat and black and just slightly too big for her feet. They made a soft shuffling sound on the tile as she walked. Her hands were clasped in front of her, held together low, like she was carrying something invisible and fragile that she couldn't afford to drop. She sat down at the defendant's table without looking at anyone in the room. She set an old manila envelope down in front of her with both hands. The edges were bent and worn soft from being held too many times. She pressed her palm flat across the top of it to smooth it down. Then she simply sat there, still, very still. The way someone sits when they have learned that stillness is the only kind of strength they have left. The whole room seemed to go just a little quieter when she sat down. I've seen thousands of defendants walk through that door over 31 years. Most of them look around when they come in. They take in the room. They find the exits with their eyes. They check who is watching them. This woman did none of that. She just sat with her folder under her hands and her eyes low, and she waited. Something about that stillness stayed with me before a single word had been spoken. The prosecutor was a young man named Davis. He was maybe 32, clean haircut, sharp tie, the posture of someone who trusted the system completely and hadn't yet been given a reason not to. I don't say that with any judgment. He was doing his job. He was doing it the only way he knew how, and in most rooms on most days, that would have been enough. He stood and walked the court through the charges calmly and efficiently. Expired registration, 18 months gone. Broken taillight, documented at the stop. Failure to appear at the original hearing, which had added the largest portion of the penalty. Total charge, $714. He said that number the way someone reads the temperature outside. No weight on it, just a fact. I let him finish. I thanked him. Then I looked across the room at the woman sitting at the defendant's table. I introduced myself by name. I told her she was not in any trouble with me. I said I just needed to understand what had been happening in her life. I asked her to tell me in her own words what the last year and a half had looked like. She looked at me like she was deciding whether to trust what she was hearing. It wasn't suspicion exactly, it was more like caution. The kind of caution that builds up slowly in a person after a long time of being let down. Then she looked down at her envelope, and then she started talking. She said the registration had lapsed because money had been stretched thin. She worked 3 days a week at a laundromat, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Her husband had passed 4 years earlier. She was living on what she made and a small pension, the taillight she had known about, and she had been putting money aside little by little to fix it. She just hadn't gotten there yet. She said each thing plainly and without self-pity, just the quiet shape of a life pulled too far in too many directions. I want to pause right here because this is the exact moment the whole story turns on. Have you ever watched someone take a breath before they say something they have never said out loud to a complete stranger before? That small gathering of courage inside a single breath, that pause before the trust. I watched her do exactly that. I could see it in the way her hands tightened just slightly on that envelope. And I waited for it. She said she had missed the original court date because her son had been in the hospital. His name was Daniel. He was 38 years old. He had gotten sick 7 months before the hearing. She had been driving to the hospital 3 and sometimes 4 times each week, sometimes before dawn, sometimes close to midnight. She had been so focused on being there for him that she had not seen the court notice until the penalty for failure to appear was already in her mailbox. She said it quietly, the way you say something you have been carrying alone for far too long. I let that settle. Then I asked her gently how Daniel was doing now. She looked down at her hands. She pressed both palms flat against the manila envelope. She didn't answer right away. The room was very quiet. The lights hummed. A chair somewhere shifted. Then she said Daniel had passed 8 days ago. She said it without anything extra around the words. Just that. Just those 4 words sitting in the middle of the room like a stone placed on a table. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The whole room just stopped. Someone in the benches behind her made a small sound. Just air leaving a body. I looked at Davis, and he was perfectly still. I looked back at Margaret. She was still looking down at her hands, pressed flat on that worn folder, not moving at all. I asked her one last thing. I asked when the funeral had been. She said yesterday morning. Yesterday morning. She had buried her son at 10 o'clock on a Monday, and she had come to my courtroom at 9 o'clock the following Tuesday. She had come because she was afraid that missing one more date would bring a warrant, because showing up was the only thing she had left that still felt like something she could control. I didn't speak for a long moment after that. I just looked at her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking for anything. She was sitting there with her hands flat on that folder, completely composed, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. And I thought that I had seen a great deal of strength in 31 years in this room. I had never seen anything quite like the strength sitting in front of me at that moment. I turned to Davis. I asked him one direct question. I asked whether anything in the law required a person to appear in court the morning after burying their child. He paused. He said, no, there was no specific provision for that. But he said the charges had all accrued before the death and the process still had to be followed. I thanked him and told him I had a few more questions. I said I understood the process. I've followed the process my entire career. I know it well enough to tell the difference between when it is serving someone and when it is simply grinding them down. I asked Davis if he had any documentation in his file about the hospitalization. He checked his file carefully. He said he didn't have any. I asked Margaret if she had anything in her folder. She slid it across the table to me with both hands. I opened it carefully. Inside were 3 items: a hospital admittance record for her son, dated 7 months earlier, a death certificate dated 8 days ago, and a thick stack of parking receipts from the hospital garage held together with a rubber band. I counted the receipts. There were 41 of them. I spread a few across my bench and looked at them carefully. Some had timestamps before 6 in the morning, some were from after 10 at night, and then I found the one that stopped everything. It was dated the same morning as the original court hearing she had missed. The timestamp on that receipt read 6:47 in the morning. I held that receipt up. I read the time out loud, 6:47 in the morning. On the exact day she was supposed to be in this courthouse, this woman was in a hospital parking garage before 7 a.m. She wasn't hiding from the court. She wasn't ignoring the law. She was where she had to be. She was there for her son. I set that receipt down and looked at the others still spread across my bench. There was one dated 3 days before Daniel died, time-stamped 6:12 in the morning. There was one from the night before the funeral, 10:44 at night. This woman had been making that drive long after most people would have found a reason to stop. I looked over at Margaret. She was watching me look through them. She wasn't asking me to feel anything. She was just watching. I asked her when she had started keeping the receipts. She said after she received the notice about the missed hearing, she started keeping everything. She was afraid nobody would believe her if she ever had to explain. She said she knew how the situation looked on paper. She just hoped that if she kept every single receipt, the truth would be somewhere in the stack. I set the receipt down and looked out at the room. This is why it matters who sits in this chair. This is why the law cannot be handed entirely over to the numbers. If you think justice is just about enforcing what's written, I want you to look at 41 parking receipts held together with a rubber band and ask yourself what they say about this woman's character. The evidence was there the whole time. She had been carrying it with her just in case someone finally asked. Davis stood. He said he understood how difficult the circumstances were. He said rules had to mean something. He said consistency was the foundation of a fair system. He was right about consistency. I've believed in consistency my entire career. But consistency without wisdom is just a machine running on its own momentum. And a machine doesn't know what 41 receipts at 6 in the morning mean. I told Davis that the purpose of this court was not to move efficiently through a docket. The purpose was to be fair. Those two things are not the same. A machine can be consistent. Only a person can be fair. Only a person can look at evidence of a life stretched past its limit and ask what justice actually looks like right now, today, for this specific human being sitting in front of us. I told him one more thing. This woman did not walk into my courtroom asking for mercy. She didn't ask for anything. She came with a worn folder full of parking receipts because she was prepared to prove herself in case nobody believed her. That is not the behavior of someone who ignored the law. That is the behavior of someone who respected it so much she was afraid it wouldn't respect her back. That difference is exactly what this chair exists to recognize. I sat with those receipts in front of me for just a moment longer. I didn't rush to the ruling. I wanted everyone in that room to have a moment to look at what was on my bench. A stack of 41 worn paper slips. Proof of a mother doing the only thing that mattered to her for 7 straight months. I looked at Margaret one more time. She was sitting exactly the way she had been sitting since she walked in. Hands flat, eyes patient, waiting. Davis looked at the receipt still on my bench. Then he looked at Margaret. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly and sat back down. I think somewhere inside him he had known since she walked through that door. The process just hadn't given him any space to say it until now. I reached for my legal pad. I wrote down the total, $714. I looked at it for a moment. I looked at the receipt on my bench. I looked at Margaret. Then I drew a clean single line through that number, all the way across both ends. I said it aloud so that every person in that room could hear it clearly and without question. The total charge was dismissed, all of it. The registration penalty, the taillight fine, the failure to appear penalty, every part of it dismissed completely. I picked up my gavel and brought it down once. That sound filled the room, and then it was absolutely quiet. That silence after the gavel is something I've never been able to fully describe. It isn't empty silence. It's full of everything that just shifted in that room. I've brought that gavel down thousands of times in 31 years. That particular moment felt different. Something settled in a way that doesn't always happen. The whole room exhaled without making a sound. Margaret did not gasp. She did not cry out. She raised both hands slowly and placed them over her mouth. Not with drama, just slowly, carefully, like she was afraid of what sound might come out if she didn't hold it in. Her eyes didn't overflow suddenly. They went wet the way a window fogs, quietly, from the inside. She sat that way for several seconds, completely still. Then she lowered her hands to the table. She pressed her fingertips flat against the surface. She breathed in through her nose and let it out slowly through her mouth. She looked up at me, and in a voice that was just above a whisper, she said, "Thank you, Your Honor." 3 words, and they were carrying 8 months of everything inside them. I asked the bailiff for just a moment. I set my gavel down on the bench. I leaned forward and spoke to her directly. Not from the bench to the defendant's table, just from one person to another. I told her that Daniel was lucky to have a mother who showed up for him every single time. I told her that showing up, no matter what it cost, was the most important thing a person could ever do for someone they loved. I told her Daniel knew she was there. I told her that every single time she walked into that parking garage before sunrise, he felt it. That kind of love doesn't disappear because a person is sick or sleeping or too far away to say thank you. It reaches. I've been in enough rooms with enough people to know that to be true, and I believe it without any doubt. She started shaking. Her shoulders moved. She put one hand over her eyes and pressed the other flat against her chest, like she was holding herself together from the inside. I let the room be still. I let it breathe. Some moments don't need more words. They need someone willing to let the silence do what it knows how to do. I was reaching for the next file when a voice came from the back of the room. A man stood up from the third bench. He was heavy-set, wearing a blue work jacket with his name embroidered on the chest in yellow thread. He said, "Excuse me, Your Honor, I know I'm not supposed to speak." I told him to go ahead. He said his name was Gerald. He said he had been Margaret's neighbor for 14 years. He said that all through those 7 months while her son was sick and she had almost nothing left to give, she still left covered meals outside his door on the nights he worked double shifts. She still called to check on his elderly mother who had her own health problems. He said there was not one single person on their street who would not stand up for Margaret without being asked twice. He said he just needed someone in that room to know that about her. The things that change a room are rarely the dramatic ones. They're the small, quiet, ordinary ones. A neighbor who drove himself to a courthouse just to say something true. 14 years of small kindnesses packed into a blue work jacket. If this story is landing somewhere in you right now, I want you to let it stay there. Don't rush past it. The small acts of love that nobody ever announces are the ones that hold the world up. And sometimes in a quiet room with humming lights, they change everything. I thanked Gerald. Margaret turned to look at him over her shoulder. He gave her one slow nod, just one, the kind that says, "I see you," and I meant every word. He sat back down. Outside, the rain had come back, not hard, just steady and present. I gathered my files and turned toward the rest of the morning. But I stayed inside that moment for one more breath. I thought about the folder she had carried in, the bent manila envelope worn soft at every edge from being handled so many times, the 41 parking receipts. Nobody keeps 41 receipts unless they are afraid no one will believe them. She had been carrying her own proof the entire time, just in case. And today, finally, someone had asked. 2 weeks after Margaret walked out of my courtroom, the story got out. It wasn't me who told it. It was Gerald. He wrote a short post on a neighborhood community page, a few plain sentences about what he had witnessed. A woman who buried her son on a Monday and came to court on a Tuesday. A judge who had listened. He wasn't asking for anything. He just felt like someone should know. Within 4 days, that post had been shared 11,047 times. I know that number because my clerk printed it out and left it on my bench. I don't have social media and I never have, but she showed me the comments. Most of them were not about me at all. Most of them were about people's own mothers, their own losses, their own mornings when they got up and went when everything inside them said, stay down. Within 10 days, 37 people in Margaret's neighborhood had put together something quiet and practical. Not a fundraiser with a big flashy name, just a handwritten list of names and commitments. People signed up to bring meals, to drive her to appointments, to call and check in on her twice a week for the next 3 months. 37 names, no organization behind it, just people who read something true and decided they wanted to be part of what came next. 11 letters arrived at the courthouse addressed to me personally. I read every single one. Some came from lawyers in neighboring counties, some from retired judges, several from ordinary people who had never once been inside a courtroom. One was from a woman who said her own mother had been in a similar situation years ago and no one had stopped to listen. She said she had been carrying the weight of that for a long time. She said she was glad someone had finally listened. I kept every one of those 11 letters in a folder in my desk drawer. They are still there. I pull those letters out sometimes on the hard days, when a case has gone in a direction I'm not sure about, and I sit with the doubt of it afterward. They remind me that what happens in this room matters beyond these walls, that people out there need to believe that someone sitting in this chair is actually paying attention. Those 11 letters are part of how I keep doing this job, part of how I keep believing it's worth doing. 6 months later, Margaret came back to my courtroom. She wasn't there for any hearing. She had sent a handwritten note asking if she could stop by to say thank you in person. I said yes. When she walked through that door, I almost didn't recognize her at first. She was wearing a blue cardigan over a pale white blouse. She had small pearl earrings in her ears. Her hair was combed and neatly set. She wasn't wearing black. She walked differently than she had in October. She came through the door upright, with her shoulders back, looking forward. She walked like someone who had set something very heavy down and was still learning how good it felt to move without it. Not like the grief was gone. Grief like that doesn't leave. But she was carrying it differently now. She was carrying it beside her, not on top of her. She told me the taillight had been fixed. She said it with a small, private smile, like she knew exactly how small it sounded and exactly how much it meant at the same time. She said the registration was current. She said she had started volunteering 2 afternoons a week at the hospital where Daniel had been treated. She wanted to sit with the people in the waiting rooms who were alone because she knew what that room felt like from the inside. She had lived inside that feeling for 7 months. She also brought a photograph. It was Daniel, taken about 2 years before he got sick. He was laughing at something off to the side of the frame, the kind of deep laugh you can almost hear through a photograph if you look long enough. He was a big man with broad shoulders and his mother's eyes. His hands were clasped in front of him, the same way she had held hers that first morning she walked into my courtroom. She set the photograph on my bench gently with both hands. She said she wanted me to know who he was. Not just a name on a form. Before I tell you how this ends, I want to ask you something, and I mean it directly. Think about a time when you showed up, when everything inside you was empty or afraid or completely wrung out, when staying home would have been so much easier and no one would have blamed you for it. But you got up and you went anyway because some part of you couldn't not go. Has anyone ever looked you in the eye and told you they saw what it cost you to be there? Has anyone ever said out loud that it mattered? Because it did. It always did. What Margaret did mattered. The people in your life who keep showing up again and again without being asked, they matter too. Don't wait for a courtroom to be the place where someone finally says so. I thought about that photograph for a long time after she left. I thought about Daniel laughing at something we would never know. I thought about his mother in that parking garage before sunrise 41 times just to be near him. I thought about the bent envelope smoothed flat on my table with her palm. The care in that one small gesture, the quiet dignity in a woman who came fully prepared to be disbelieved and wasn't. I've sat in this chair for 31 years. I've watched people carry more than any one person should ever have to carry alone. I've seen the system do its job correctly and still miss the human being entirely. I've also seen the moment when one right question, asked at the right time, shifts the entire weight of a day for someone who walked in with nothing. That is what this job is, not the rules, not the docket, not the number on the page. The moment when you stop everything and you actually see who is sitting in front of you. And then someone did. That is the whole of it. That is everything 31 years in this chair has taught me about what justice really is. It isn't a code of rules. It isn't a number on a page. It isn't even a verdict. Justice is the moment when another human being finally feels seen.